My brothers inherited a $39 million company, and I got nothing but a one-way ticket to India. My family laughed as they threw me out like trash. But when I arrived in Mumbai, my mother was waiting with documents that revealed the most shocking secret of my life. Those 7 words she whispered changed everything and turned me into their worst nightmare. But before I tell you what happened, subscribe to our channel. For you, it might be just a click, but for us, it's the fuel we need to keep finding and sharing incredible stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, let me start from the beginning. My name is Mia, and for 22 years, I lived with the weight of a sin I never committed, being born from love that society deemed inappropriate. My father, William Whitmore, fell in love with my mother, Priya, during his separation from his first wife, but when that reconciliation happened 3 years later, I became the living reminder of his mistake. While my half-siblings, Alexander and Victoria, represented the legitimate continuation of the Whitmore legacy, I was the uncomfortable truth they all wanted to forget. Every family dinner was a silent trial where my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. Every business conversation a reminder that this $35 million empire would never truly be mine. My father tried to shield me, including me in company discussions and teaching me about international markets, but I could see the strain it caused. The constant tension between his love for me and his need to maintain family peace created a household where affection was rationed and approval had to be earned daily. What I didn't understand then was that every slight, every dismissal, every moment of rejection was teaching me the most valuable lesson of all: how to survive when the world decides you don't belong. The Whitmore mansion in Lake Forest felt like a beautiful prison where I served a sentence for crimes I couldn't comprehend. While Alexander learned to play golf at the country club and Victoria attended cotillion balls, I spent my afternoons in my father's study, absorbing every business journal and quarterly report I could find. The irony wasn't lost on me that I probably knew more about market trends and competitive analysis than my siblings, yet I was the one considered irrelevant to the company's future. My stepmother, Margaret, treated me with cold politeness, never cruel enough to give my father grounds for complaint, but never warm enough to let me forget my place. "She's William's responsibility," I once overheard her telling my grandfather Harrison, "but she's not our family's future." Those words carved themselves into my heart, joining the collection of small wounds that accumulated over years of being tolerated rather than embraced. The household staff showed me more genuine warmth than my own relatives, but even they understood the hierarchy and kept their distance when family members were present. My grandfather Harrison was the architect of my isolation, the patriarch who had built Whitmore Industries from nothing and couldn't accept that his bloodline had been contaminated by foreign influence. He never said it directly, but his message was clear in every interaction. I was a reminder of my father's moral weakness, a living contradiction to the family's carefully cultivated image of traditional American success. During board meetings that I was occasionally allowed to observe, I watched him dismiss any suggestion I made before I could finish speaking, his pale blue eyes looking through me as if I were invisible. "This is a family business," he would say when anyone questioned my exclusion from important decisions. "And family means understanding your place." The cruelty was subtle, but devastating, designed to make me question my own worth rather than his prejudice. What he didn't realize was that his rejection was teaching me to rely on myself, to develop the kind of inner strength that comes from having no safety net. Every dismissal made me more determined to prove that worth isn't inherited, it's earned. The academic excellence I achieved at Northwestern felt hollow when it couldn't translate into acceptance at home. My business degree with highest honors, my fluency in Hindi learned secretly through online courses, my innovative ideas about expanding into South Asian markets, none of it mattered to a family that had already decided my story for me. I graduated at 21 with job offers from 3 Fortune 500 companies, but my father convinced me to stay and work for Whitmore Industries as a junior analyst. The position was designed to keep me busy without giving me any real influence. filing reports that were never read and attending meetings where my opinions were politely ignored. Alexander, 2 years older and fresh from an unremarkable MBA program, was already being groomed for executive leadership despite his obvious lack of vision or drive. Victoria, with her marketing degree and natural charm, handled client relationships and public relations with competence if not brilliance. They were the golden children preparing to inherit an empire, while I was the unwanted reminder of complications they preferred to forget. When my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago, the family dynamics shifted in ways that revealed everyone's true priorities. My siblings increased their presence at company headquarters, positioning themselves as indispensable leaders while my father's health declined. I became his primary caregiver, spending countless hours in hospital rooms and specialist offices while they attended board meetings and client dinners. "Promise me something, Beta," he whispered during one of our late-night conversations, using the Hindi endearment that always made me feel seen. "Promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that you're less than them. You have strength they'll never understand because you've had to earn everything they've been given." I thought he was simply trying to comfort a daughter who was losing her only ally in the world. I had no idea he was preparing me for the most elaborate test of character ever designed, or that his love had been working behind the scenes for years to ensure I would never have to depend on people who couldn't appreciate my worth. The months following my father's diagnosis became a masterclass in family cruelty disguised as practical planning. Dinner conversations revolved around succession planning and leadership transitions, as if I weren't sitting at the same table. Alexander spoke confidently about modernizing operations without demonstrating any understanding of what that actually meant, while Victoria discussed brand evolution in ways that revealed her superficial grasp of marketing fundamentals. My grandfather presided over these discussions like a king distributing kingdoms, clearly delighted that my father's illness had removed the last obstacle to his preferred vision of family inheritance. When I attempted to contribute ideas about international expansion or technology integration, the conversation would mysteriously shift to other topics, leaving me feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. The message was unmistakable. They were planning for a future that didn't include me, and my father's protection was the only thing standing between me and complete exile from the family I had never really belonged to. The funeral 2 months ago was a performance of grief that felt more like a celebration of liberation for everyone except me. As hundreds of Chicago's business elite offered condolences to my siblings and grandfather, I stood slightly apart, mourning not just the loss of my father, but the end of any hope that this family might someday accept me. The eulogies painted my father as a visionary leader and devoted family man, conveniently omitting any mention of his relationship with my mother or the daughter that relationship had produced. Jefferson Bradley, our family attorney for over 20 years, approached me after the service with an expression I couldn't interpret, something between sympathy and anticipation. "The will reading is scheduled for next Friday," he said quietly, "and your father was very specific about who needed to be present." His tone suggested significance beyond the usual legal formalities, but I assumed it was simply my father's final attempt to ensure I received some small inheritance that would help me start an independent life. I spent the week preparing for the emotional difficulty of hearing my father's final wishes, never imagining that his death would actually be the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter of my life. The law office of Bradley and Associates felt like a courtroom where my entire future hung in the balance, though I assumed the verdict had already been decided in favor of my siblings. The mahogany conference room, with its intimidating portraits of legal giants and shelf after shelf of leather-bound law books, seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, only to find Alexander and Victoria already seated with their individual attorneys, a detail that should have warned me something significant was about to happen. They looked confident, almost smug, whispering together while reviewing documents that had apparently been shared with them in advance. My grandfather Harrison entered precisely on time, his silver-headed cane tapping against the marble floor with the authority of someone who had controlled every important decision in this family for 50 years. The way they avoided eye contact with me suggested they knew something I didn't, and their barely concealed excitement made my stomach churn with anxiety about what my father's final judgment on my place in the family would be. Jefferson Bradley had aged considerably since my father's diagnosis, his usually perfect composure showing cracks that suggested the weight of secrets he'd been carrying. As he arranged papers on his desk with unnecessary precision, I noticed his hands trembling slightly, whether from age or emotion, I couldn't tell. "William's will is unique," he began, his voice carrying decades of professional experience in delivering difficult news, and he insisted that certain elements be kept confidential until this moment. The formal language couldn't disguise the personal affection he'd felt for my father, and I caught him glancing at me with something that looked almost like apology. "Before we begin," he continued, producing a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's careful handwriting, "William insisted that Mia read this letter aloud to the family." My hands shook as I accepted the envelope, wondering why my father would want to put me through the humiliation of reading his final thoughts about my inadequacy in front of people who already believed I didn't belong. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, heavier than a simple goodbye should be. The letter began normally enough, with my father's familiar expressions of love and pride in the woman I'd become despite the challenges I'd faced. But as I continued reading, the words took on a significance that made my voice falter. "My dearest Mia, by the time you read this, you will understand that everything difficult in your life has been preparation for something extraordinary. The rejection you've experienced wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. Every dismissal made you stronger. Every exclusion made you more self-reliant. Every moment of being underestimated taught you to exceed expectations." I could feel the tension in the room shifting as my family realized this wasn't the apologetic farewell they'd expected. "The inheritance I'm giving you isn't money or property. It's opportunity. A chance to discover who you really are when you're not trying to earn acceptance from people who were never capable of appreciating your worth." The letter's final lines hit me like lightning. "The ticket in the envelope isn't exile, my darling daughter. It's your chance to claim an inheritance that will change not just your life, but the entire trajectory of this family's future. Trust the journey, and remember that love sometimes requires difficult lessons." Inside the envelope was indeed a plane ticket, one way to Mumbai, departing in 4 days, but also a small key and a business card for a law firm in India, with a note. "Present this key to Priya Sharma at the address on the card. She has something that belongs to you." The room erupted in confusion as my siblings and grandfather tried to process what they'd just heard. "What inheritance?" Victoria demanded, her composed facade cracking as she realized this wasn't the simple exile they'd orchestrated. "There's nothing in India except—" she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought about my mother. Alexander's face had gone pale as he began to understand that my father's final act might not be the convenient removal of an unwanted family member they'd anticipated. Jefferson Bradley cleared his throat and continued with the formal reading. "To my son, Alexander, I leave my voting shares in Whitmore Industries, conditional upon his successful leadership for a period of 5 years. To my daughter, Victoria, I leave the family's real estate holdings, also conditional upon the company's continued profitability." The word conditional hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, suggesting that my father's final plan contained complications none of us had foreseen. My grandfather's reaction was swift and brutal, his face contorting with a rage I'd rarely seen even from him. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his cane striking the floor with sharp emphasis. "William has lost his mind in his final months, filling that girl's head with impossible fantasies. There's nothing in India except the mistake he made 25 years ago." His words were intended to hurt, to reduce my mother and our relationship to something shameful that needed to be hidden, but they had the opposite effect. For the first time in my life, I felt sorry for him. Sorry that his prejudice had blinded him to possibilities beyond his narrow understanding of value and worth. Victoria joined the attack with her characteristic precision. "This is emotional manipulation from a dying man who felt guilty about his daughter's situation. There's no mysterious inheritance waiting in India, Mia. There's just an aging woman who abandoned her responsibilities to chase some ridiculous dream of independence." Their cruelty was familiar, but it felt different now, desperate rather than confident, like attacks from people who suddenly weren't sure they held all the power. Alexander tried a different approach, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of dismissing my contributions to family discussions. "Mia, we understand that Dad's death has been difficult, and maybe this fantasy of some secret inheritance is how you're coping with grief. But the reality is that you need to start building a real life for yourself instead of chasing impossible dreams." His concern felt manufactured, designed more to convince the attorney that he was the reasonable voice in the room than to actually help me. "If you insist on going to India," he continued with calculated generosity, "we're prepared to provide financial support to help you get established. But this idea that there's some hidden fortune waiting for you is just—" He gestured helplessly, as if the very concept was too absurd to address seriously. What none of them realized was that their immediate, coordinated effort to convince me not to go to India had the opposite effect. It made me absolutely certain that my father's plan contained elements they feared, and that this ticket represented something far more significant than a convenient exile. Jefferson Bradley had remained silent during the family's emotional outburst, but I could see in his expression that he knew more than he was revealing. "Mia," he said quietly, "your father was very specific that the choice must be entirely yours. No one can force you to go, and no one can prevent you from going. But he wanted you to understand that this opportunity will not come again." The weight of the moment settled over me as I realized that this decision would determine not just where I lived, but who I would become. I could stay in Chicago, accept whatever modest support my family offered, and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Or I could trust my father's love and his belief that I was strong enough to face whatever he had planned for me in a country I'd never seen, with a mother I barely remembered. The ticket felt heavy in my hand as I looked around the room at faces that had never shown me genuine acceptance. And suddenly, the choice became crystal clear. "I'm going," I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to India, and I'm going to find out what my father really left me." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks, pregnant with possibilities that none of us could fully imagine. The 14-hour flight to Mumbai gave me too much time to question my decision and imagine every possible disaster waiting for me in a country I knew only through my father's romanticized stories and my own limited research. As the plane crossed time zones and continents, I alternated between excitement and terror, wondering if I was flying toward opportunity or simply running away from the only life I'd ever known. The business class seat my father had somehow arranged felt like a luxury I didn't deserve, surrounded by successful-looking travelers who seemed confident about their destinations, while I clutched a mysterious key and fought waves of anxiety about meeting a mother who was essentially a stranger. The few memories I had of Priya were fragments from early childhood, her melodic voice singing Hindi lullabies, the smell of exotic spices in our kitchen, her gentle hands braiding my hair before she disappeared from my life forever. Would she even recognize the grown woman I'd become? Would she welcome me or resent my unexpected arrival as a burden she'd successfully escaped 20 years ago? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was moving towards something unknown rather than trying to fit into spaces where I'd never belonged. Mumbai assaulted my senses with an intensity that made Chicago feel sterile by comparison. The heat, the humidity, the cacophony of car horns and street vendors, the press of humanity that seemed to flow like water around every obstacle. As I emerged from customs with my 3 suitcases and overwhelming uncertainty, I searched the crowded arrival area for someone who might be waiting for me. The address on the law firm's business card had seemed straightforward from the safety of Jefferson Bradley's office, but navigating an unfamiliar city in a foreign country suddenly felt impossible. Just as panic was beginning to set in, I heard my name called in accented English, Miss Mia Whitmore. A professionally dressed young man approached with a tablet displaying my photograph. I am Arjun, from Sharma and Associates. Mrs. Priya is waiting for you. The relief was overwhelming as he efficiently collected my luggage and led me to a waiting car that was neither luxurious nor shabby, simply practical transportation that suggested my mother's circumstances were modest but stable. As we navigated through traffic that seemed to operate on rules I couldn't comprehend, Arjun chatted easily about Mumbai's weather and my flight, carefully avoiding any questions about why I was here or what I was expecting to find. The law office of Sharma and Associates occupied 2 floors of a modern building in Bandra, a neighborhood that felt like Mumbai's attempt to recreate the commercial districts I knew from American cities. The reception area was comfortable without being impressive, with contemporary furniture and local artwork that suggested success without ostentation. As Arjun led me to a conference room, I tried to prepare myself for the first real conversation I'd had with my mother since childhood, wondering how we would bridge 20 years of separation and all the complicated emotions that distance had created. When the door opened and Priya entered, I was struck by how small she seemed compared to my childhood memories, though her presence filled the room with the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine confidence rather than inherited position. Her hair was silver now, styled in a practical bob that framed features that were undeniably similar to my own, and her simple blue dress suggested professional competence without pretension. "Beta," she said softly, using the Hindi endearment that brought tears to my eyes. "You look so much like your father. Come, sit. We have much to discuss." The next 2 hours unraveled everything I thought I knew about my parents, relationship, and my place in the world. Priya explained that her departure from Chicago hadn't been an abandonment, but a strategic withdrawal, orchestrated by my father to protect both me and a plan they'd been developing since my birth. "William knew his family would never accept you," she said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing an unfortunate but unchangeable reality. "But he also knew that rejection would make you stronger than Alexander or Victoria could ever be. While they were handed everything, you had to earn respect, develop resilience, learn to survive in hostile environments." She opened a folder containing photographs that documented her life over the past 20 years. Images of a small textile business that had grown into something more substantial, awards for innovation and community leadership. Pictures of her with local politicians and business leaders that suggested influence beyond what her modest office indicated. "Your father sent money, yes, but more importantly, he sent guidance, market analysis, connections to American suppliers who needed Indian manufacturing partners. What started as a favor to help me establish independence became something much larger." The key my father had left me opened a safety deposit box at a bank around the corner, and what we found inside changed everything I thought I understood about my inheritance. The box contained legal documents establishing my ownership of 60% of Sharma Industries, a company that had grown from my mother's small textile operation into a diversified manufacturing business with operations across India. But these weren't the documents of a successful small business. They were the papers of a company in crisis, hemorrhaging money due to a combination of currency fluctuations, supply chain disruptions, and a major client's bankruptcy that had left them overextended and vulnerable to collapse. "Your father's final gift wasn't a fortune. Beta," Priya explained with tears streaming down her face. "It was a test. He left you a company that's worth millions if you can save it, but that will be worthless in 6 months if you can't. Everything he taught you about business, every slight that made you stronger, every moment of being underestimated, it was all preparation for this moment." The magnitude of the challenge was breathtaking. I had 6 months to save a company I knew nothing about, in a country where I was a foreigner, using skills I'd never tested outside of theoretical discussions in Northwestern classrooms. The factory tour the next morning revealed the full scope of both the opportunity and the crisis waiting for me. Sharma Industries employed over 800 people across 3 facilities, producing everything from high-end textiles to precision manufacturing components for electronics companies. The workers were skilled and dedicated, but I could see the anxiety in their faces as rumors of financial trouble had begun affecting morale and productivity. The equipment was modern and well-maintained, the quality control systems were impressive, and the products themselves were competitive with anything produced in more developed markets. But the financial records told a different story. Accounts receivable were dangerously high, cash flow was negative, and the company was less than 90 days away from being unable to meet payroll. "The employees don't know how bad it is," admitted Rajesh, the operations manager who had been my mother's partner in building the business. "But they sense something is wrong. If word gets out that we're in trouble, we'll lose our best people to competitors who are already trying to poach them." The weight of 800 families depending on decisions I wasn't qualified to make felt crushing, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about my inheritance anymore. It was about proving I deserved the faith my father had placed in me. As I stood in the main production facility, watching skilled workers create products that would compete in global markets, I realized that my father's final lesson was about to begin. Everything I'd learned about resilience, about fighting for respect, about succeeding despite being underestimated, would be tested in the most consequential way possible. The comfortable life I'd imagined finding in India, reconnecting with my mother while discovering my inheritance, had been replaced by a challenge that would require every skill I'd developed and some I'd need to learn quickly. But for the first time since my father's death, I felt something other than grief and uncertainty. I felt purpose. The scared young woman who had fled Chicago with a one-way ticket was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything depended on her success. 6 months to save a company, prove my worth, and possibly, if I succeeded, return to the family that had dismissed me with resources they couldn't imagine. The real test of my father's faith in me was about to begin, and failure wasn't an option that 800 families could afford. The first month at Sharma Industries nearly broke me. Every morning I arrived at the factory by 6 a.m., determined to understand every aspect of a business that was bleeding money faster than I could identify the sources of the hemorrhaging. The language barrier was more challenging than I'd anticipated. While most managers spoke English, the workers communicated in Hindi, Marathi, and regional dialects that left me feeling isolated and ineffective. My MBA from Northwestern had prepared me for theoretical case studies, not the practical reality of motivating a workforce that wondered if their jobs would exist next month. The financial records were a maze of currency conversions, supplier contracts written in languages I couldn't read, and regulatory requirements that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford as I spent nights studying Hindi language apps and days trying to project confidence I didn't feel while making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but it was also educational. I was learning more about real business in these desperate weeks than I had in 4 years of academic study. The breakthrough came during my 4th week, when I discovered that our biggest client's bankruptcy hadn't been a sudden financial collapse, but a strategic manipulation designed to acquire our company at a fraction of its value. Sitting in the empty cafeteria after another 18-hour day, I was reviewing contracts when I noticed patterns in the payment delays and order cancellations that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. A little investigation revealed that Meridian Industries, our former client, had been systematically creating cash flow problems for their suppliers before swooping in with acquisition offers that desperate companies couldn't refuse. The revelation was infuriating, but also liberating. We weren't failing because of poor management or inferior products. We were being attacked by a predator who had underestimated our ability to fight back. For the first time since arriving in Mumbai, I felt something other than overwhelming pressure. I felt anger, and anger was fuel I knew how to use. The shy girl who had spent 22 years trying to earn acceptance was about to discover what happened when someone tried to steal from her family. The plan I developed required more audacity than experience, but my father's lessons about competing with established players finally made sense in a real-world context. Instead of trying to replace the lost revenue from Meridian Industries, I focused on their competitors who were frustrated with Meridian's aggressive tactics and questionable business practices. Using contacts my mother had developed over 20 years, and adding my own research about American companies looking for reliable international suppliers, I began pitching Sharma Industries as the ethical alternative to working with corporate raiders. The presentations were terrifying. My Hindi was still elementary, my understanding of local business culture was superficial, and I was representing a company that was weeks away from insolvency to potential clients who could afford to be choosy. But desperation had stripped away the self-doubt that had plagued me in Chicago, replacing it with the kind of focused determination that comes from having no alternative to success. When you're fighting for survival, perfectionism becomes a luxury you can't afford. The first major contract came from an unexpected source, Chen Technologies, whose CEO, Marcus Chen, remembered my father fondly and was impressed by what he called my refreshing honesty about our current challenges and realistic plans for recovery. The $3 million order for precision components was exactly the lifeline we needed to stabilize cash flow and buy time to implement longer-term solutions. But more importantly, Marcus introduced me to other American executives who were interested in diversifying their supply chains away from companies like Meridian Industries. Within 2 months, I had secured enough new business to not only save the company, but position it for growth that would make us a significant player in the regional market. The workers who had watched me stumble through basic Hindi conversations now greeted me with genuine smiles and enthusiasm that felt better than any acceptance I'd ever received from my family in Chicago. I was discovering that respect earned through competence and dedication was infinitely more satisfying than respect inherited through bloodline. The personal transformation was as dramatic as the business recovery. The uncertain young woman who had arrived in Mumbai with no real-world experience was becoming someone I barely recognized. Confident, decisive, comfortable with authority in ways that would have been impossible in the shadow of my family's dismissive attitudes. Learning Hindi was no longer just practical necessity, but a source of pride as I connected with employees and suppliers in their own language. The cultural differences that had initially seemed overwhelming became advantages as I learned to navigate a business environment where relationships mattered as much as contracts, and where personal trust could accelerate negotiations that might take months in more formal settings. My mother watched these changes with a mixture of pride and amazement, often commenting that I was becoming the leader my father had always believed I could be if given the opportunity to develop without the constraints of others' low expectations. But the most satisfying change was internal. I was finally discovering who I really was when I wasn't trying to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted. The call from Alexander came on a Tuesday evening in December, exactly 6 months after I'd left Chicago with nothing but a one-way ticket and wounded pride. I was in my office reviewing plans for expanding our operations to Bangladesh when my assistant announced that my half-brother was on the international line, claiming it was urgent family business. His voice carried a mixture of condescension and barely concealed desperation as he explained that Whitmore Industries was encountering some challenges and wondered if I might be interested in consulting opportunities that would benefit from my recent international experience. The transparent attempt to frame their crisis as my opportunity was almost laughable, but I listened patiently as he described problems with suppliers, quality control issues, and competitive pressures that sounded remarkably similar to the challenges I'd been solving for months. "We value family loyalty," he concluded with the kind of forced sincerity that politicians use when asking for votes, "and we think this could be mutually beneficial." I promised to consider his proposal and call back within a week, though I already knew exactly what my answer would be. The game my father had designed was entering its final phase, and I was finally ready to play. As I stood on the terrace of my Mumbai apartment that night, looking out over a city that had become home in ways Chicago never had, I realized that my father's greatest gift hadn't been the company he'd left me. It had been the confidence that comes from succeeding despite overwhelming odds. The young woman who had cried alone in an airplane seat 7 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who had saved a company, earned the loyalty of hundreds of employees, and discovered what she was capable of when fighting for something that mattered. Tomorrow I would begin planning my return to Chicago, but not as the exile seeking forgiveness or the abandoned daughter hoping for acceptance. I would return as the CEO of a successful international company, armed with skills and experiences my siblings couldn't imagine, ready to have conversations they wouldn't expect. My father had spent 22 years preparing me for this moment, and I was finally worthy of the faith he'd placed in me. The real inheritance was just beginning. The return to Chicago in March felt like traveling between different lives rather than simply changing continents. The confident businesswoman who had emerged from the crucible of saving Sharma Industries bore little resemblance to the uncertain young woman who had fled with a one-way ticket 8 months earlier. As my plane descended toward O'Hare, I could see the city spread out below me like a game board where I finally understood all the rules and held better pieces than any other player. The meeting with Alexander had been scheduled for the next day at Whitmore Industries headquarters, but I had my own agenda that began with visiting Jefferson Bradley to understand the full scope of my father's final strategy. The leather portfolio beside me contained contracts worth $15 million, expansion plans that would make Sharma Industries a significant player in American markets, and most importantly, documentation that would reveal just how thoroughly my father had prepared for this moment. 8 months ago, I had left Chicago as an unwanted reminder of family complications. I was returning as something they had never expected me to become. Their equal. Jefferson Bradley's reaction to seeing me again was worth the entire trip back to Chicago. The elderly attorney who had delivered my father's mysterious inheritance rose from behind his desk with an expression of amazement and something approaching joy. "My God, Mia," he said, studying my face with the intensity of someone seeing a work of art come to completion. "You look like your father did when he was building this empire, confident, focused, dangerous to anyone who underestimated him." Over the next 2 hours, he revealed the full scope of the plan my father had spent 20 years developing, beginning with a safety deposit box that contained stock certificates, legal documents, and a letter explaining the final phase of my inheritance. The shares my father had accumulated weren't in Whitmore Industries directly, but in a holding company that controlled key suppliers and distribution partners that my family's business depended on for survival. "He knew they would never accept you as an equal," Jefferson explained. "So he positioned you to be their superior. The company that bears the Whitmore name is actually dependent on infrastructure your father controlled and has now transferred to you." The elegant revenge was breathtaking in its sophistication and patience. The meeting at Whitmore Industries the next morning was theater of the highest order, though my family didn't realize they were performing in a play I had already read. The conference room where I had been humiliated 8 months earlier now felt smaller, less intimidating, as if my perspective had fundamentally shifted during my time away. Alexander and Victoria greeted me with the kind of forced warmth that people use when they need something but don't want to admit it, while my grandfather Harrison maintained his usual cold distance, though I detected uncertainty in his pale blue eyes that hadn't been there before. They had prepared presentations about Whitmore Industries, challenges and opportunities, carefully framing their crisis as routine business fluctuations that a fresh perspective might help address. What they didn't understand was that I already knew more about their problems than they did, thanks to the comprehensive analysis my father's connections had provided. Their suppliers were demanding better terms, their largest clients were exploring alternatives, and their production costs were rising faster than their ability to raise prices. They were slowly being strangled by market forces they couldn't control, and I was the only person in the room who understood why. The revelation began slowly, as I started asking questions that demonstrated knowledge they hadn't expected me to possess. "How are your negotiations going with Precision Components International?" I inquired casually, referring to a supplier whose contract renewal was apparently causing them significant anxiety. Victoria's surprised expression told me she hadn't anticipated that I would know about their supply chain difficulties, while Alexander's fumbled response revealed that the negotiations were going poorly. "And what about your distribution agreement with Midwest Logistics?" I continued, watching their confusion grow as I demonstrated awareness of problems they thought were confidential. My grandfather finally interrupted with characteristic bluntness. "How do you know about our internal business matters?" The moment had arrived for the reveal that would change everything. "Because," I said, opening the portfolio Jefferson Bradley had prepared, "as of this morning, I own the companies you've been negotiating with. Precision Components, Midwest Logistics, Advanced Materials Supply. They're all subsidiaries of holdings my father transferred to me. Your supply chain, your distribution network, your ability to operate profitably, it all depends on my approval now." The silence that followed was profound as the implications sank in. My family had spent 8 months believing they had successfully exiled the unwanted reminder of their complications, only to discover that she had returned with the power to determine their future. Alexander was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely controlled panic. "That's impossible. Dad wouldn't have... He couldn't have..." But the legal documents I spread across the conference table told an undeniable story of strategic planning that had taken 20 years to implement. "Your father was very patient," I explained, using the same matter-of-fact tone my mother had used when revealing my inheritance in Mumbai, "and very thorough. Every time you dismissed me, every time you made it clear I wasn't welcome in this family, he was building a structure that would eventually give me the power to make my own decisions about who deserved consideration." Victoria's perfectly composed facade cracked as she began to understand that the balance of power had shifted permanently. "What do you want?" she whispered, though I suspect she already knew the answer. The terms I offered were generous considering the circumstances, though they represented a complete inversion of the family hierarchy that had defined my entire life. Whitmore Industries could continue operating under existing management, but all major decisions would require approval from their new majority shareholder, me. Alexander and Victoria could retain their positions if they demonstrated competence, but they would report to a board of directors I would chair. My grandfather Harrison would retire immediately with a comfortable pension, but no further involvement in company operations. "Think of it as succession planning," I suggested with a smile that probably looked as satisfied as it felt. "Odds with leadership going to the family member who actually proved capable of running a successful business." The alternative, as I explained with devastating clarity, was for them to find new suppliers and distributors in a market where I would be actively competing against them using superior resources and market knowledge they had helped me develop through years of dismissal and underestimation. The choice was theirs, but we all understood that only one option allowed them to maintain the lifestyle and status they had taken for granted. 6 months later, I stood in the same corner office where my grandfather had once held court, but the nameplate on the mahogany desk now read, "Mia Whitmore, Chairman and CEO." The view from the executive floor looked the same, but everything else had changed in ways that still amazed me. Whitmore Industries was thriving under new leadership that actually understood modern markets and global competition, with profit margins that exceeded anything achieved under the previous regime. Alexander had surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming an effective operations manager once freed from the pressure of living up to impossible expectations. Victoria had discovered genuine talent for international business development, particularly in South Asian markets where her sister's connections proved invaluable. My grandfather Harrison had initially resisted retirement, but eventually admitted that he was proud of what I had accomplished, though his approval no longer mattered the way it once had. The bastard daughter who had been handed a one-way ticket to exile was now the undisputed head of the family business empire. But more importantly, she had become someone who no longer needed anyone else's validation to know her worth. My father's final gift hadn't been revenge. It had been the opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped trying to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted and started creating spaces where I belonged. So, what did you think of this revenge? Leave a comment below with your opinion. Subscribe to the channel. Just press the red button below. And hey, there's another explosive story already appearing on your screen right now. Click here and I guarantee this next one will surprise you even more. Go ahead, click here and I'll see you in the next video.